The morning air on December 19th, 1944, carried the sound of distant artillery like summer thunder rolling across the Ardennes forest. Staff Sergeant James Hendricks of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion stood beside his M18 Hellcat, watching his breath form clouds in the freezing Belgian air. Behind him, the crossroads town of Bastogne sprawled across the landscape, its church spires rising above stone buildings that had stood since medieval times. Hendricks had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, he and fewer than a dozen men from his battalion would find themselves as the primary armour defence for an entire encircled town, facing the largest German offensive of the Western Front. The question that haunts military historians to this day isn't whether Bastogne could be held, we know it was, but how such small numbers of American tank destroyers and airborne infantry managed to destroy nearly 50 German panzers in a week of desperate fighting, while cut off from all ground reinforcement. The mathematics shouldn't work. The doctrine said it was impossible. Yet the wreckage of German armour that littered the snow around Bastogne by Christmas told a different story, one written in the tactical genius of desperation and the fatal flaws of German offensive doctrine in late 1944. To understand how this happened, we must first understand what Bastogne represented in the winter of 44, and why both sides knew that whoever controlled this obscure Belgian town would determine the fate of Hitler's last gamble in the West. Bastogne was nothing special to look at. A market town of roughly 4,000 inhabitants, it sat at the convergence of 7 major roads, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. In peacetime, farmers brought cattle and grain to its markets. Its strategic value came entirely from geography. Those 7 roads made Bastogne the key to movement through the densely forested Ardennes. An army, trying to advance through this terrain without controlling Bastogne, would find itself channeled into narrow forest tracks, vulnerable and slow. The Americans understood this. More importantly, so did the Germans. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By mid-December of 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be entering its final phase. Allied armies had liberated France and were pushing toward Germany's western frontier. In the southern sector, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was grinding through the fortified Siegfried Line. In the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group was preparing for operations across the Rhine. The entire Allied front stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea, a distance of over 400 miles, and American commanders felt confident that German forces were spent, incapable of anything more than defensive fighting. This confidence was built on solid intelligence and reasonable assumptions. Since the D-Day landings in June, German armies in the West had suffered catastrophic losses. The Falaise Pocket alone had cost the Wehrmacht over 200,000 casualties and the destruction of 50 divisions worth of equipment. The fighting retreat across France had been a bloodbath. By December, Allied intelligence estimated that Germany had neither the reserves nor the fuel to mount any significant offensive operations. The industrial capacity wasn't there. The manpower wasn't there. The strategic situation made any major attack illogical. They were wrong. Adolf Hitler had been planning Operation Wacht am Rhein Watch on the Rhine since September. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, and nearly 1,000 tanks, would punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in 2, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. It was the same strategy that had worked brilliantly in May of 1940, when German panzers had raced through these same forests to the English Channel, cutting off and destroying French and British armies in the process. Hitler believed he could do it again. His generals, reading the maps and inventory reports, knew better. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Wehrmacht's senior commander in the West, called the plan insane. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured doctrine, protested that stripping the Eastern Front of reserves to fuel this offensive would lead to disaster when the Soviets launched their winter offensive. But Hitler was beyond rational military counsel by late 44. He had survived the July 20th assassination attempt and his paranoia had curdled into messianic certainty. Germany would attack. The plan would succeed because he willed it to succeed. The offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944. Across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, German artillery opened fire with a ferocity the Western Front hadn't seen since 1918. Searchlights mounted on tanks lit the winter sky, reflecting off low clouds to create artificial moonlight for the advancing infantry. The Americans holding this sector, mostly Green divisions sent here to rest, or recuperating units from earlier battles, were completely unprepared. Within hours, German armor had punched multiple holes in the American line. The initial German success was stunning. Entire American regiments were surrounded and destroyed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. By December 17th, German panzers were racing westward, and panic was spreading through Allied headquarters. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, grasping the situation faster than many of his subordinates, immediately understood that the key to stopping this offensive lay in controlling the road junctions. The Germans needed those roads. Deny them mobility, force them onto forest tracks, and their entire offensive would bog down. He ordered the airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, to immediately deploy to the Ardennes. These were elite units, paratroopers who had jumped on D-Day and fought through Normandy and Holland. They were, crucially, the only significant Allied reserves not already committed to combat. The 101st Airborne received orders to move to Bastogne. They had 18 hours to get there before German pincers closed around the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe took command. His orders were simple. Hold Bastogne at all costs. He had roughly 11,000 paratroopers from the 101st, plus scattered remnants of armoured and engineer units that had retreated into the town ahead of the German advance. Against him, German commanders were concentrating. Elements from 3 divisions, the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, with explicit orders from Hitler himself that Bastogne must fall quickly. But the Germans had a problem, one that would prove fatal to their entire offensive. They had planned for speed, not for siege. German logistics in late 1944 were catastrophically inadequate. The Wehrmacht was short on everything: fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, even food. The offensive plan assumed German units would capture American supply dumps intact and use Allied fuel to continue their advance. This wasn't contingency planning. It was structural dependence on capturing enemy supplies. German armor columns literally could not reach their objectives on the fuel they carried. They had to capture more along the way or stop dead. This meant the German advance couldn't afford delays. Every hour spent reducing a strongpoint was an hour burning precious fuel while sitting static. Every bypassed American position became a threat to supply lines that were already stretched beyond breaking, and Bastogne, sitting on those 7 crucial roads, couldn't be bypassed. It had to fall, and it had to fall immediately. It didn't fall, and in the week that followed, small groups of American soldiers, tank destroyer crews, engineers, paratroopers, and artillerymen fought a defensive battle that shattered German armour in numbers that still seem implausible when you read the after-action reports. Staff Sergeant Hendricks and the men of the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion were never supposed to be the primary anti-armour defence of Bastogne. Tank destroyer doctrine in 1944 emphasised mobility and concentration. The idea was that TDs, fast, lightly armoured vehicles mounting powerful guns, would operate as a mobile reserve, rushing to threatened sectors, ambushing enemy armour, then withdrawing before enemy artillery could respond. They were hunters, not defenders of fixed positions. The M18 Hellcat that Hendricks commanded embodied this philosophy perfectly. It could reach 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest armoured vehicle of the war. Its 76mm gun could penetrate the frontal armour of most German tanks at combat ranges, but its own armour was thin, less than 1 inch at its thickest point. A direct hit from German tank or anti-tank gun would punch through the Hellcat's armour like paper. The vehicle's survival depended on not being hit, on using speed and surprise rather than protection. But there was no mobility at Bastogne. By December 21st, the town was completely surrounded. German forces controlled every road leading in or out. American units inside the perimeter were fixed in place, and the tank destroyers couldn't maneuver to favorable ambush positions because there was nowhere to maneuver to. They would have to fight from static positions against an enemy that could choose when and where to attack. The numbers looked grim. The 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived in Bastogne with 3 companies, each supposed to field 12 M18 Hellcats. But casualties during the initial German breakthrough and mechanical breakdowns on the rushed movement to Bastogne had reduced their strength. By the time the encirclement was complete, the battalion had perhaps 16 operational vehicles. Against them, German forces were deploying over 100 tanks and assault guns, including Panthers and Panzer IVs, backed by infantry and artillery. The first German assault on the Bastogne perimeter came on the morning of December 20th from the northeast, where elements of the 2nd Panzer Division attempted to punch through American lines toward the town centre. Staff Sergeant Hendricks's platoon was positioned along the Longvilly Road, dug in behind a slight rise that provided the only cover in otherwise open farmland. The ground was frozen, solid, making digging difficult, but it also meant the M18S had firm footing and clear fields of fire. Hendricks watched through his commander's periscope as German infantry advanced in extended lines, covered by the hulking forms of Panzer IV tanks. The Panthers were staying back, probably in reserve. Smart tactical decision used the less valuable Panzer IVs to probe American defences, identify anti-tank positions, then bring up the Panthers to destroy them. Standard German doctrine. The problem for the Germans was that Hendricks had been fighting them since Normandy. He knew their playbook. He waited. Discipline in anti-tank warfare is everything. Fire too early, and you reveal your position before you can inflict decisive damage. The German tanks were still over 1,000 yards out. At the edge of effective range, Hendricks let them come closer. 800 yards, 700. His gunner, Corporal Eddie McCollum from Tennessee, tracked the lead Panzer IV through his sight. At 600 yards, Hendricks gave the order. The Hellcat's 76mm gun cracked, and the lead Panzer IV shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine deck. McCollum was already traversing to the 2nd tank. Another shot, another hit. The German armour formation wavered, then stopped, crews unsure where the fire was coming from. In the confusion, Hendricks's platoon destroyed 3 more Panzer IVs in as many minutes. Then the German artillery found them. High-explosive shells began walking across the American position, orange flashes erupting in the frozen earth. Hendricks ordered his driver to pull back to their alternate position, 300 yards to the rear. The Hellcat's speed saved them. They were hull down behind a barn before the German gunners could adjust fire. From this new position, they had an oblique view of the same road. When the German tanks resumed their advance, assuming they'd suppressed the American anti-tank position, Hendricks's crew hit them again, from a different angle. By noon, the German attack had stalled. 5 Panzer IVs sat burning in the snow. German infantry, without armour support and under fire from American paratroopers in the tree line, pulled back. The 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion had validated its doctrine. Mobility, even on a small scale, multiplied the effectiveness of every vehicle. The Germans couldn't fix American positions because those positions kept changing, but this tactical victory came at a cost that would define the entire Bastogne siege. The tank destroyers had expended significant ammunition. Each M18 carried only 45 rounds of 76mm ammunition in its ready racks. Hendricks's platoon had fired nearly 80 rounds in the morning engagement they'd had to break open reserve ammunition stored in the town. And there was no resupply coming. The roads were cut. The railroad was controlled by Germans. Every round fired was irreplaceable. General McAuliffe faced a brutal calculus. His artillery had perhaps 10,000 shells on hand when the siege began. His infantry were rationed to basic loads of rifle ammunition. The tank destroyers needed to conserve every anti-tank round because once they were gone, There would be nothing to stop German armour except bazookas, short-range infantry weapons, effective only from suicidally close distances against the frontal armour of a panzer or panther. The weather made everything worse. Low clouds and freezing fog grounded Allied aircraft. The vaunted American air superiority that had dominated the skies since D-Day was irrelevant when pilots couldn't see the ground. German commanders knew this. Their entire offensive had been timed for a period of forecasted bad weather. As long as the clouds stayed low, they could maneuver without fear of fighter bombers, and they could starve Bastogne into submission without American transport planes delivering supplies. On December 22nd, the situation in Bastogne was critical enough that German commanders thought the Americans might be ready to surrender. A delegation approached American lines under a white flag, carrying a typed ultimatum. The message, addressed to the American commander, warned that Bastogne was surrounded by strong German forces, that further resistance was futile, and that if surrender didn't come within 2 hours, the Germans would destroy the town with artillery. The message promised honorable treatment as prisoners of war if Americans surrendered immediately. General McAuliffe's reply has become legendary. Nuts! His operations officer, having to translate this for the confused German officers, settled on, "Go to hell." The Germans withdrew. The siege continued. But McAuliffe's defiance, however famous, didn't change the material reality. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The wounded were being treated in makeshift aid stations with inadequate equipment. Food was being rationed. And German pressure was increasing from all directions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German assault on December 23rd marked a significant escalation. Elements of Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armoured formations, attacked from the west with over 40 tanks and assault guns supported by fresh infantry regiments. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a deliberate, coordinated assault designed to break the American perimeter and reach the town centre. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, commanding the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion, repositioned his remaining M18s to meet this threat. He had perhaps 14 operational Hellcats left too, had been knocked out in previous fighting, and several more were down for repairs. 14 vehicles against 40 German tanks. The mathematics were stark, but Templeton had advantages the Germans didn't fully appreciate. First, his crews were experienced. Many had been fighting since North Africa or Sicily. They understood tank warfare at an intimate level, the psychology of tank commanders, the blind spots of different vehicles, the telltale signs of inexperienced crews. Second, the defensive terrain around Bastogne favoured concealment. The Ardennes landscape of rolling hills, small woods, and scattered buildings offered multiple positions where a hull-down tank destroyer could hide until German armour came into optimal range. Third, and most crucially, the tank destroyer crews were fighting from what they knew to be their final positions. There was no retreat, no fallback line. Every German tank that broke through meant German infantry penetrating into Bastogne itself, where American wounded lay in aid stations and where supply dumps held the ammunition that kept the defense functioning. The psychological difference between defending an abstract position and defending ground where your friends are bleeding out in field hospitals is immeasurable. The tank destroyer crews fought with the knowledge that loss meant death not just theirs, but everyone behind them. The main German attack materialized along the Marche Road, where Panzer commander had identified what he believed was a weak point in American defenses. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. Templeton had positioned a platoon of M18s in covered positions along that road, sighted so they could engage German armour moving down the roadbed while remaining invisible from the German approach angle. The engagement began at first light. German tanks, advancing in column because the road was the only good ground in otherwise swampy terrain, ran directly into the ambush. The lead Panther took a 76mm round through its side armour, thinner than the frontal plate, and exploded internally as ammunition cooked off. The second Panther tried to back up but collided with the Panzer IV behind it. In the confusion, American tank destroyers systematically engaged targets from ranges of 400 to 600 yards, the sweet spot where their guns were effective, but German return fire was hampered by poor visibility and the psychological shock of ambush. Within 20 minutes, 8 German tanks were burning. The attack collapsed. German infantry, without armor support and under artillery fire from American 105mm howitzers that were down to their last 1,000 rounds, withdrew. Panzerlehr's commander reported to headquarters that the American defenses were stronger than intelligence had suggested, and that further attacks would require significant reinforcement. But the cost to the defenders was mounting. One M18 had been knocked out by a long-range shot from a German tank destroyer. Another had thrown a track trying to reposition and was immobilized. Ammunition expenditure was approaching crisis levels. Templeton's battalion had started the Plays siege with roughly 700 rounds of 76mm ammunition. They were now down to fewer than 300 rounds. Every engagement meant choosing which targets to engage and which to let pass, hoping that infantry with bazookas could deal with them. The pressure on Bastogne's defenders wasn't just military. The civilian population of the town, unable to evacuate before the encirclement, sheltered in cellars while artillery shells crashed overhead. American medical personnel treated both military casualties and civilians wounded by the constant shelling. The Bastogne aid stations became nightmares of triage, surgeons operating by flashlight, nurses working 20-hour shifts. The town's priest, Father Louis, moved between positions, giving last rites to dying soldiers of both sides, American and German. A small act of humanity, in conditions that had long since stripped away normal human decency. The turning point came not from tactics or courage, but from weather. On the morning of December 23rd, the clouds that had blanketed the Ardennes for a week began to break. Patches of blue appeared in the grey sky. By mid-morning, the ceiling had lifted enough for aircraft to operate. At Allied airfields across France and England, pilots who had been grounded for days scrambled to their planes. The first indication that the siege was breaking came as a distant rumble, growing louder. Staff Sergeant Hendricks, positioned along the eastern perimeter, looked up to see formations of C-47 transport planes approaching from the west, flying at low altitude. Behind them came fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts, that immediately began hunting for German armor around the perimeter. The air armada was massive, over 200 transport aircraft carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The supply drop was chaotic but effective. Parachutes filled the sky over Bastogne, drifting down onto American positions. Some landed in German-held territory and had to be abandoned, but most reached their targets. By afternoon, ammunition that had been critically low was replenished. The tank destroyer crews received fresh 76mm rounds. Artillery batteries, down to their last few shells, suddenly had thousands. The psychological impact was as important as the material. The Americans in Bastogne realized they weren't alone. Help was coming, but the German attacks didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. German commanders knew that if they couldn't break through before Allied relief columns reached Bastogne, their entire offensive would collapse. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, German forces launched their most determined assault yet, hitting the American perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The assault from the northwest, led by elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, focused on the village of Champs, held by elements of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and a platoon of M18 Hellcats from the 705. The German plan was sound: use darkness and fog to close the distance before American observers could call in artillery, then use superior numbers of infantry and tanks to simply roll over the American position. The attack began at 3 a.m., German infantry advancing through the darkness with tank support. American sentries detected movement and called in artillery, but the Christmas Eve fog was so thick that shells were landing by sound and guesswork rather than observed fire. German tanks pushed into Champs village itself, their commanders believing they'd achieved breakthrough. They were wrong. Sergeant Hendricks's platoon, repositioned to Chance the previous day, had prepared defensive positions in the village with meticulous care. They'd learned from a week of continuous combat that survival meant preparation. Each M18 had multiple firing positions prepared, with routes between them scouted and obstacles cleared. They'd coordinated fields of fire with the paratroopers so that German armor would be channeled into kill zones. When German Panzer IVs entered Champs, they found themselves in a close-quarters battle in a village they didn't know, fighting defenders who had every angle covered. The first German tank to reach the village square was hit from behind by a Hellcat positioned in a barn. The shell penetrated the thin rear armor and detonated the fuel tank. The explosion lit the village square with orange fire, silhouetting the other German tanks for American gunners. In rapid succession, 3 more panzers were destroyed. The German infantry, without effective armor support and under fire from paratroopers positioned in the stone buildings, began to pull back. By dawn, the attack on Chance had collapsed. 7 German tanks sat burning in the village streets and surrounding fields. The cost to the Americans, 1 M18, damaged by artillery, no crew casualties. But the simultaneous German attacks on other sectors of the perimeter were having more success. To the south, near the village of Assenois, German forces had punched a significant dent in American lines. Volksgrenadier infantry had overrun forward positions, and Panther tanks were moving up to exploit the gap. If this penetration wasn't sealed, German forces would have a direct route into Bastogne from the south. General McAuliffe committed his last reserve. A company of paratroopers from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment and 2 M18 Hellcats that had just returned to operation after field repairs. It was a tiny force to plug a major breach, but it was all he had left. The paratroopers moved out on foot through snow and fog, racing to reach the threatened sector before German armor could exploit the gap. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding one of the M18s in this counterattack, later described the surreal experience of fighting in near-zero visibility. His crew could hear German tanks, the distinctive sound of their engines and tracks, but couldn't see them through the fog. Navigation was by compass and dead reckoning. They advanced slowly, every man tensed for the moment when a German tank would materialize out of the white murk at point-blank range. The collision came near a farmhouse on the southern edge of Assenois. Boggess's Hellcat rounded a hedgerow and found itself facing a Panther at less than 100 yards, both crews equally surprised. In tank combat, whoever fires first usually survives. Boggess's gunner, Corporal James Parker, was fractionally faster. The 76mm round hit the Panther's turret at the junction, with the hull a weak point where armor was thinner. The Panther's turret jammed, unable to traverse. A second round finished it, but now Boggess's position was compromised. German infantry nearby had heard the engagement and were calling in support. Boggess pulled back to a hull-down position, behind the farmhouse, and waited. Over the next 2 hours, his crew engaged and destroyed 2 more German tanks attempting to move through the breach. By the time paratroopers secured the position with infantry, the German penetration had been contained. The pattern repeated across the Bastogne perimeter throughout Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Small groups of American tank destroyers, working in coordination with paratroopers and engineers, defeated German attacks that should have overwhelmed them through superior numbers. The key wasn't superior equipment. German Panthers were better tanks than M18 Hellcats by most measures. The key was intimate knowledge of the terrain, preparation of multiple defensive positions, and the tactical flexibility that came from experienced crews who understood their machines completely. By December 26th, the siege of Bastogne had lasted a week. The 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion had started with approximately 18 operational M18 Hellcats. They now had 9 vehicles still in fighting condition, but the ground around Bastogne was littered with destroyed German armor. Post-battle counts identified 47 German tanks and assault guns knocked out within the Bastogne perimeter during the siege, with the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion claiming credit for 30 of those kills, confirmed by examination of wreckage and determination of which weapons had inflicted the damage. The numbers seemed impossible. 9 American tank destroyers, never more than 18 at any point, had destroyed 30 German tanks in 7 days of combat while fighting from static defensive positions against an enemy that could choose when and where to attack. The kill ratio was over 3-1 in favor of the defenders. For comparison, typical Eastern Front combat in 1944 saw the Germans maintaining favorable kill ratios even while losing territory. At Bastogne, American tank destroyer crews had achieved results that rivaled the best German Panzer aces. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th, when elements of General Patton's Third Army, driving north through brutal winter conditions, broke through German lines and opened a corridor into the town. The lead elements were from the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. When their Shermans reached the Bastogne perimeter, they found American paratroopers still holding their positions, tank destroyer crews still manning their guns, and General McAuliffe still defiant. The siege was over, but the battle for Bastogne continued for weeks. German forces made repeated attempts to cut the corridor and re-isolate the town. The fighting through January of 1945 was, in some ways, more intense than the siege itself. But the strategic moment had passed. The German offensive had spent itself against Bastogne and other strongpoints. The panzers that might have reached the Meuse River and threatened Antwerp had burned out their fuel sitting in front of towns they couldn't capture. The American defense, improvised and desperate, had worked. Staff Sergeant Hendricks survived the siege and continued fighting with the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion through the final campaigns in Germany. His M18 Hellcat, the same vehicle he'd commanded at Bastogne, was knocked out in February 1945 near the Rhine. Hendricks and his crew survived, bailed out, and were assigned a replacement vehicle. They fought until Germany surrendered in May. After the war, Hendricks rarely spoke about Bastogne. When he did, usually decades later to military historians researching the battle, he downplayed the dramatic elements. His accounts focused on technical details, firing angles, ammunition management, the difficulty of keeping vehicles operational in sub-zero temperatures. The heroic narrative that grew around Bastogne embarrassed him. He insisted that what they'd done wasn't remarkable. It was, simply their job, executed as well as circumstances allowed. But the numbers tell a different story. The 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions at Bastogne, one of the highest collective honours the U.S. military can award. Individual crews received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. The battalion's after-action report, filed in January 1945 and now stored in the National Archives, provides meticulous documentation of each engagement: dates, times, positions, targets, ammunition expended, results. Reading these reports today, what emerges is a picture of small unit excellence under impossible conditions. The tank destroyer crews at Bastogne didn't win through superior technology or overwhelming force. They won through superior training, tactical flexibility, and the kind of combat expertise that only comes from extended combat experience. By December of 1944, the American Army had been fighting in Europe for 18 months. Units like the 705 had learned their craft in North Africa and Italy, refined it in Normandy, and perfected it in the fall campaigns across France. The German army they faced at Bastogne was different from the Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe in 1940. The losses on the Eastern Front had bled the German military of its most experienced units. The troops attacking Bastogne included many recently mobilized Volksgrenadier Division's infantry formations with less training and fewer veterans than regular Wehrmacht divisions. Even the panzer units, while still formidable, were experiencing crew quality problems. Germany was running out of experienced tank commanders. This wasn't apparent from casualty reports or equipment counts, but it showed in combat effectiveness. German attacks at Bastogne were often poorly coordinated, with infantry advancing without effective tank support or tanks pushing forward without infantry to suppress American anti-tank weapons. The sophisticated combined arms tactics that had characterized German operations earlier in the war were breaking down. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous. American casualties at Bastogne exceeded 2,000 killed and wounded, but it was no longer the supremely professional force that had overrun France in 1940. The broader strategic picture explains why the defense of Bastogne mattered so much. Hitler's Ardennes Offensive was predicated on speed. German forces needed to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours and Antwerp within a week. Every day of delay meant more time for Allies to rush reinforcements to threatened sectors. Bastogne sat astride the road network the Germans needed for rapid advance. By holding Bastogne for even a few days, American forces disrupted German logistics and forced them to commit reserves to reducing the town rather than exploiting their initial breakthrough. By the time the siege ended, the German offensive had already failed strategically. Even though fighting continued for weeks, German forces never reached the Meuse. They never came close to Antwerp. The offensive consumed Germany's last mobile reserves in the West reserves that would have been far more valuable defending the Rhine frontier when Allied armies resumed their advance in February 1945. The cost was staggering. German casualties in the Ardennes Offensive exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Over 700 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe, making its final significant appearance over the Western Front, lost over 300 aircraft. These were losses Germany couldn't replace. Every panzer destroyed at Bastogne was one less defending the Rhine. Every experienced crew killed was irreplaceable. American casualties were also heavy, roughly 19,000 killed and wounded during the entire Ardennes campaign, with another 15,000 captured. But the United States could replace these losses. Replacement soldiers and equipment flowed into Europe throughout January and February. By March of 1945, American forces in Europe were stronger than they'd been before the German offensive began. The small stories within the larger battle reveal the human dimension of what happened at Bastogne. Private First Class Richard Brookins, a loader on one of the M18 crews, wrote home to his family in Ohio describing Christmas Day 1944. The letter, which survived among his personal papers, describes sharing a meal of cold sea rations with his crew, listening to distant artillery, and wondering if they'd survive to see another Christmas. He did, barely. His Hellcat was knocked out on December 27th, and Brookins suffered severe burns. He spent 6 months in hospitals recovering. Lieutenant Colonel Templeton, commanding the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion, submitted his after-action report with unusual detail, apparently aware that what his battalion had accomplished would be studied by future military analysts. His report notes that the key to their success was aggressive defense, a phrase that seems contradictory but captures the essence of their tactics. Rather than waiting passively for German attacks, the tank destroyer crews actively hunted enemy armor within the constraints of the perimeter, repositioning constantly, and engaging targets at maximum range before pulling back to alternate positions. This wasn't standard doctrine. Tank destroyer doctrine emphasized mobility at operational scale, moving entire battalions to threatened sectors. But at Bastogne, mobility meant tactical repositioning of individual vehicles within a fixed perimeter. The crews adapted their doctrine to circumstances, improvising tactics that later became formal doctrine for defensive operations. The aerial resupply operation that sustained Bastogne also deserves recognition. Between December 23rd and December 26th, the 9th Air Force flew over 900 sorties over Bastogne, delivering over 800 tons of supplies despite poor weather and German anti-aircraft fire. Pilots flew transport planes slow, unarmed C-47 seconds through flak and fighter attacks because they knew American soldiers on the ground would die without those supplies. Several aircraft were shot down. Crews volunteered for these missions knowing the risks. The fighter bomber support that began on December 23rd was equally critical. P-47. Thunderbolts attacked German armor and supply columns around Bastogne with devastating effectiveness. German forces that had been able to maneuver freely under cloud cover suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Tank columns caught in the open by fighter bombers suffered catastrophic losses. German commanders, accustomed to Allied air superiority, had gambled that weather would neutralize this advantage. When the weather cleared, that gamble failed. General McAuliffe's nuts response to the German surrender demand has become famous, but it overshadows his actual accomplishment at Bastogne. McAuliffe commanded a composite force thrown together from multiple units, most of which had never worked together before. He coordinated artillery, infantry, armor, and tank destroyers into an effective defense while managing civilian evacuation, medical care for casualties, and supply distribution under siege conditions. His command post in Bastogne was shelled repeatedly. He made decisions under pressure that most officers would find paralyzing. When military historians analyze Bastogne today, they focus on several factors that explain how such a small force held against overwhelming numbers. First, the quality of American units involved. The 101st Airborne and supporting elements were experienced, well-trained soldiers. Second, the defensive terrain favored the defenders, providing cover and concealment. Third, American artillery was superbly effective, with forward observers calling in precise fire that broke up German attacks before they could develop momentum. But fourth, and perhaps most important, was the tactical proficiency of small units like the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion. These were soldiers who understood their craft completely. They knew their equipment's capabilities and limitations. They understood how to read terrain, how to coordinate with infantry, how to manage ammunition under scarcity. They could make life-or-death decisions in seconds, because their training and experience had made these decisions almost instinctive. The contrast with German forces is instructive. The Wehrmacht of 1944 still had excellent units, particularly in the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions. But the overall quality was declining. Training time for tank crews had been cut. Fuel shortages meant less time for exercises. Replacement crews often went into combat with minimal experience. At Bastogne, this manifested in tactical errors, tanks advancing without reconnaissance, attacks launched without adequate preparation, poor coordination between armor and infantry. The German army was dying, not from single catastrophic defeat, but from accumulated attrition that couldn't be replaced. Every experienced crew lost was replaced by one less experienced. Every destroyed tank was replaced by one built with lower quality steel using slave labor. The industrial and manpower base that had sustained the Wehrmacht through years of war was collapsing. Bastogne was one more cut in 1,000 that were bleeding Germany to death. By January 1945, when the Bulge was finally eliminated, the strategic picture was clear to everyone except Hitler. Germany had lost the war. The only question was how much longer it would take and how many more would die. The Red Army was preparing its final offensive from the east. Allied armies in the west were massing for the assault across the Rhine. German cities were being reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. There was no path to victory, no hope of negotiated peace. Only defeat remained, and the only choice was how much destruction Germany would suffer before accepting the inevitable. The soldiers at Bastogne didn't know they were fighting one of the war's decisive battles. They knew only that they were cold, hungry, running low on ammunition, and that German tanks kept coming. They fought because surrender meant death or captivity, because their friends were fighting beside them, and because stopping fighting never occurred to them as an option. The grand strategic implications were for historians to puzzle out later. Staff Sergeant Hendricks returned to Texas after the war. He used the G.I. Bill to attend college, became an engineer, married, raised 4 children. He attended 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion reunions sporadically, uncomfortable with the attention that came from Bastogne veterans. When the History Channel interviewed him in 1998 for a documentary about the battle, he was 76 years old, still precise in his recollections of firing angles and ammunition management, still dismissive of the notion that what he'd done was extraordinary. He died in 2003. His obituary in the San Antonio Express-News mentioned his military service in a single line. Veteran of World War II, including the Battle of the Bulge. No mention of Silver Star, no dramatic recounting of destroying German tanks, just another veteran passing, one of the millions who served, fought, and came home to quiet lives. But the record remains. The after-action reports, the unit citations, the wreckage of German armour photographed by combat engineers after the battle. 9 M18 Hellcats from the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion, never more than 18 at any point, destroyed 30 confirmed German tanks during the siege of Bastogne. 47 total German tanks were destroyed within the perimeter by all American forces. Small numbers of dedicated soldiers, fighting from prepared positions with weapons they understood completely, defeated a numerically superior enemy through superior tactics and skill. This is the reality that the title question asks us to consider. How did such small numbers hold Bastogne? The answer isn't found in mythology or heroic narrative. It's found in training, experience, tactical flexibility, and the unglamorous work of preparing firing positions, managing ammunition, and coordinating with infantry. War at the tactical level isn't glorious. It's cold soldiers making life-or-death decisions about firing angles and ammunition conservation. The defense of Bastogne worked because American doctrine, logistics, and training systems produced soldiers who could function effectively under catastrophic conditions. The tank destroyer crews at Bastogne were the product of a military system that had learned, from early defeats, adapted doctrine based on combat experience, and trained soldiers to think tactically rather than just follow orders. By late 1944, the American Army in Europe was a professional force that could match or exceed German tactical proficiency in most circumstances. This was new. In 1942 and early 43, American forces had struggled against experienced German units. The defeats in North Africa, the bloody learning curve in Italy, these were the price of building a professional army from a peacetime force. By December of 44, that price had been paid. The American soldiers at Bastogne were professionals, and they fought like it. The irony that should resonate is this. Hitler launched the Ardennes Offensive, believing that Allied armies were soft, that American soldiers lacked the will to sustain heavy casualties, that a sharp blow would fracture Allied unity. He was wrong on every count. The defense of Bastogne and other strong points demonstrated that American forces could take heavy casualties and keep fighting, that unit cohesion was strong enough to sustain defensive battles under siege conditions, and that Allied unity held firm under pressure. The German soldiers who attacked Bastogne were, in many cases, fighting with skill and courage under terrible conditions. They deserved better leadership than Hitler's strategic fantasies. The offensive they were ordered to execute was doomed before it began, predicated on assumptions that were false and logistics that were impossible. They died taking ground that couldn't be held, attacking strongpoints that couldn't be reduced, pursuing objectives that couldn't be reached. And in the cold hills around an obscure Belgian market town, a few hundred American soldiers with tank destroyers and determination wrote the epitaph for Hitler's last offensive in the West. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.